This episode of the Seventh Valkyrie Podcast is brought to you entirely by fan support. To help keep the series ad-free, get early access and bonus features, browse gear and apparel, join the community, or watch the series come to life in living color, you can check out the links in the description. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Seventh Valkyrie Podcast. I'm your host, Colin Sharp, founder, creator, author, voice. I do everything. I don't know, I love how every time I come into this podcast, my titles are different, because I'm just like, here's several things that I do for this project. Anyway, totally unrelated. Well, not totally unrelated, but welcome to this podcast. And so the title of this podcast is... What's the morality? What are the morals of privilege? How do you deal with all of the interesting questions that come from this world where you have such a vast amount and diversity of different forms of privilege? And how do you engage with those? I think I wrote a podcast probably 2 years ago about diversity in fantasy and inclusivity and how you tackle that. Because even back then, the fact that when you're a straight white guy writing stories with all sorts of colorful characters that are very clearly influenced by people of color and by different races and genders and ethnicities and cultures, it's easy to feel like it is easy to make some serious mistakes. At the same time, it's also easy to feel like, all right, cool, what right do I have to speak about any of these things? And at the same time, it's like, well, it's a fantasy world. But kind of building off of that, one thing I'd been thinking about recently was I wanted to bring up is just kind of like, as we live in this world where so many of us are privileged in so many ways, and so many of us are disadvantaged in other ways, and even my us is probably the most privileged, so that doesn't even. Some people might not identify with me as part of their us. It's just a fascinating system of questions. And it all kind of started from the fact that I guess with the exception of my family having even more money than they do, I'm as privileged as I could possibly be. And this is not to say that my family is not wealthy. They're just, they're not giga rich or mega rich or even rich necessarily. But like on the outside of that, it's like I am a neurotypical cisgender heterosexual white male from an affluent stable family raised in the majority religion of the U.S., or at least one sect of it. And on top of that, I had a great family with no abuse, no deaths, and 2 siblings and an extended family who I love very much. Literally the only piece of bad luck and disadvantage I got in life was I have a super addictive personality. And who doesn't? But I don't know, that realizing that I have so many gifts in my life that I didn't earn because I just popped out as a child to a given set of parents looking a certain way and with a certain amount of genetics, it kind of always has me thinking about the morality and the how we associate these things with we associate some traits and some qualities with being morally valuable, and and I wanted to kind of, and sometimes I always wonder how much of those can we rely on us having privileged, like being generous. Like if you were super poor, how it would be a lot harder to develop generosity. Is that if you were kindness and empathy, if you'd grown up in a war-torn nation and you had to fight for your life, very different. If you suffered through abuse, it would be hard to understand and forgive people for violence. There's a lot of privilege that comes into all of these virtues that we try to push. And so, it kind of introduces this modulation to morality and to the rules that we are kind of established of everybody's the same. It's well, our situations aren't the same. And I do like how in the U.S. right now and all around the world, we've kind of begun speaking about and understanding and checking our privilege and being aware of the advantages that people have had and being grateful for them. And, I do that all the time. Like, I try to wake up every day grateful for the gifts I've been given, and I try and live a life worthy of them. But there are still questions out there that, like, I think about a lot and that I want, and I can't bring every answer, and I won't have an answer at the end of this, spoiler alert, but there are questions, and I like bringing them up to you guys because I feel like you guys are smart and you like hearing interesting things. How do we truly, one example that was big for me was, how do we truly value our own accomplishments and personal pride if we know that a significant portion of our opportunities came from privilege? Like, obviously we needed to seize those opportunities, so there's pride there that we did that, but too often people attribute an easier start to some sort of moral superiority, like, oh, like, I am smarter than you and I make more money and I'm more successful and I can support my family. It's like, well, yeah, you went to nice schools, you didn't have to work a job by the time you were 13 and drop out of high school, and you could afford, and your parents sent you to an expensive college, like, and you had connections and opportunities. Like, I myself, like, for all that I worked hard in school, I got a job mostly because of a connection that I made, and I had to step up and do it, but other people wouldn't have gotten that opportunity. So it's interesting to think about, like, how much of that can how do we check our privilege when it comes to our accomplishments and understanding people and appreciating people? And other questions, like, as human beings in an increasingly connected society, how do we engage with our friends and individuals that are both more privileged and less privileged than ourselves? Because I have both types of people in my life. Treating humans as humans and respecting the individual struggles and success of each of us seems like a good idea. And that's, Brene Brown has spoken on some stuff similar to that, and I tend to trust a lot of the things that she says because it just makes sense. And it's backed on, thousands and thousands of case studies of grounded theory research. So that also helps with it. But I guess for an example, like, if I'm 27 and I've got a buddy who's 27, like, obviously, like, parents tend to pay for kids, or, like, because it's understood that, like, they're further ahead in their career. But, like, if I'm 27 and I've got a buddy who's 27 and I've been lucky enough to get a job through my career, but he's overcome poverty to follow his passion as a chef, like, and is still working on starting his new restaurant, like, it might make sense that I pay for dinner a little bit more often than does that change our friend dynamic as equals, or does it just mean we're both giving what we can based on our current situation? You have that same thing with anybody, where it's like, okay, like, in an equal friendship, equal partnership, like, sometimes fair isn't equal and equal isn't fair. That's kind of an interesting topic to think of, especially when it comes to money. And again, it comes back to, I think, just treating humans as humans and respecting that each of us has individual successes and struggles. But I don't know, like, these are lots of little questions that pop up, and I'm sure will continue. But, like, how do we approach this world in which, everyone else has such a vastly different story? And I don't know. I think it's something worth, pausing to noodle on. But I actually think that if we can understand the ways that we're different from other people, I think that actually helps us understand all the ways that we're the same. And just because someone came from a different background, or has less money, or has less experience, or maybe, had a disability, or, whether it was intellectual or physical, or had a rough, upbringing, or for whatever reason, or just didn't have as many opportunities, I think, despite all that, ultimately we are more the same than we are different. And I think being aware of the differences helps us realize exactly how much we are all the same. So anyway, it's funny, this is actually a topic we dive into a ton in the Seventh Valkyrie, as we explore the haves and the have-nots. And privilege, whether, are the Eterans privileged, for being a dominant nation, or are the Freelanders privileged for having their literal gifts? It's, what do we do with those? How do we influence this world, and what is our role in this world if there are people who have incredible gifts that have been given them that can change the world, and maybe we're just an average everyday human? So anyway, all that to say, interesting questions. Some of the stuff that we're going to dive into a little bit in season 2. Still on the way, still editing about chapter and a half a day now. By the time this comes out, I may already be recording, I may not. but goddamn, boys and girls, we are, and non-binary people, we are, and cats and dogs and lizards and fish. I don't think I have any fish that listen to me. Hearing isn't so good in the ocean. Anyway, all of that to say, we're rocking and rolling. By the time you hear this, things will have changed, and that's okay. I don't know what that weird sound was. Anyway, I might even cut that, or I might not. That'd be really funny to have all that whole conversation about cutting it and then just leave this whole discussion in. Probably will do. I don't know. I love you guys. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Seventh Valkyrie Podcast, which is brought to you entirely by fan support. To help keep the series ad-free, get early access and bonus features, browse gear and apparel, join the community, or watch the series come to life in living color, you can check out the links in the description.